Hello everyone. Today I am going to be talking about the first part of my life. I have been contacted, or I have been messaged by several people who would like to know more about me and my life. And I can say there's more than 5 but fewer than 20. So if this sort of content doesn't float your boat at all, then please let me know, and it will save me going through the rest of it. I intend to make it in bite-sized chunks so I don't make you go to sleep. Anyway, if you would like to know more about me, then stick around. When I was born, my father was in the army. He was in the music side of it and busy working his way up in rank. My mother, well, my birth, I do believe, knowing what I do now, sent her into a spiral of postnatal depression. And after my birth, at some point, I was sent to my aunties who live in the north of England, so I could be looked after by them. My mother spent quite a bit of time in hospital. She had electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, and from what I've seen, it is still used today, but it looks quite a brutal thing to go through. Eventually, she came out of hospital and she started looking after me again. I don't think that they had a terribly kind, nurturing type of relationship. My father was focused on his career. My mother was at home with a small child, not really having very good mental health. So I can understand, having gone through postnatal depression myself, how it must have been for her. She was living in not a very nice apartment, in not a very nice apartment building, and my father and her were not well off. They were very, very hard up, in fact. So the next period that I don't remember that period, but that's what I've been told. However, the part of my growing up that I do remember quite vividly is when we all moved to Germany on a posting. That was quite exciting. It was a new country, and when your family is in the army, the rest of the regiment goes with you. So all your friends get packed up and we all travel as one. So that's quite handy. You don't need to make new friends. I have some pleasant memories of those days. Going to the Nuffy, getting a comic, coming home. That was good. However, throughout my parents' marriage, my mother was quite mercurial. She could fly off the handle. You didn't know when it was coming. She would get very, very angry, and you just had to watch out. And I can remember lots of times when my father and she would go at it hammer and tongs. So clearly, even then, their marriage was unhappy. Fast forward to when I was 7, and we were packed off to Malaysia. And the most vivid memories I have of Malaysia is that we were in a very nice bungalow with a roundabout as a driveway and big gates at the door, and that instead of milk at school, we got a nice lolly, which has to be just wonderful. We had an armour who was a servant, a cleaner, a housekeeper to come in every day. She was lovely. And I would go to her little tiny home and play with her daughter. So I do remember that. I can also remember being burnt so badly, so often, that my mother would say, oh, you had the blisters the size of saucers. And frankly, we just didn't wear sunscreen in those days. And because of that, my skin has been damaged. So that now I do get skin cancers popping up, and yet I don't sunbathe, so they have to come from that period. At one point, I realised my mother was no longer around. I can't remember who looked after me then, but I knew she was in hospital, and my father would take me to visit her, and she just didn't seem right. It was only when I became an adult in my 30s that my father told me she was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and that out of everybody, she loved her own mother best, and thereafter my father. She didn't mention me. So there you go. I think staying in Malaysia away from her own mother was just too much for her. So we packed up, my mother and I, and we left Malaysia, and we came back to England, where my father bought a small bungalow for my mother to live in. But he actually never moved in. They divorced very quickly. I don't know what was going on. My father was very good looking and terribly charming. And I think he was a little bit of a ladies' man, and clearly my mother wasn't a stupid woman. And I think once that starts happening, you get an inkling, because things change in your relationship. They change, you notice it, you don't say anything, but you start looking, and then, the cat's out of the bag, as it were. So we're back in England. I'm at a little comprehensive school down the road. And eventually my father came home, and he was posted to Germany, and my mother did not want to leave England again. So we ended up staying in our little bungalow, and my father went off to Germany on his own, where he met my stepmother. She was much younger. She worked at a bank, and they fell in love, I suppose, and he then divorced my mother. And she was furious. I think she really did love him, but she had such a temper that she could be frightening. She could actually be very frightening. I can even remember staying at my mother's house. Well, it's a little flat. And because there was so little room, my mother, my father, and I slept in the big double bed, and I was small enough to sleep in the middle of the two of them, which was very hot. And then one night, I can remember just waking up as I saw a fist flying just above my face, because I looked up, and it was my mother. She punched my father in the eye and split his eye open. So he left, and they were both saying to me, "Who do you want to stay with? Who do you want to stay with?" And of course I couldn't make up my mind. It was an awful, awful thing to say to a small child. I adored my father, but I ended up staying with my mother. And he would come back to see me every so often, which was sort of sad. And I worried about him. I worried for his welfare. Eventually, neither of them wanted a small child around. I think they decided between them that they would find out about sending me to boarding school to get rid of me. So eventually, when I was 11, or nearly 12, I think, because it was the September, my mother said, "Oh, you're going to go to boarding school." And I was one of those children who read the Mallory Towers books about life in a boarding school, and I thought it was going to be amazing. Just amazing. I was totally there, and it was nothing like that. So I was very keen. So my father took me to Bentall's in Kingston and got me some of the uniform, not all of it, for some reason, not all of it. My mother took me to the railway station, well, she took me to Waterloo station. She didn't go with me. I mean, she didn't go all the way to the boarding school with me. She just took me to the platform and then left. And I think, would I have done that with my own child? Absolutely not in a million years. But there you go. So she got me to the station, she got me to Waterloo, and then she said, "Get on that train there and it will take you to Rustington, Sussex." So I did, and eventually I found other pupils that were going to the school as well, eventually. And it was a rude awakening once I got to boarding school, because not only didn't I have all the required uniform, that's a very bad mark against you if you don't have it, but also none of my uniform, not a single piece, was name tagged. And if you've ever been to boarding school, you know they hang a very high priority on having everything name tagged so it doesn't get lost, and I can understand that. But my mother hadn't done any of that, or my father hadn't ensured it was done. There was so little preparation for my own welfare done by either of my parents. They found the school, they packed me off, done, got rid of her. They didn't think of all the things that I might need. So on my first day, we had to get our trunks. We had trunks, not suitcases. Get our trunks and then empty the whole lot face up with the name tag on it on our bed. The beds had horsehair mattresses. They were very thin, and the rooms had no central heating. So in the winter, we would have ice on the inside of this very old boarding school in our very old bedroom, drafty and everything. So the matron came in. She inspected my uniform, and I was off to the worst start possible. She had me out as a troublemaker, I suppose, because I hadn't got name tags and I hadn't got half the uniform. So that was a very bad start, whereas everybody else did. I mean, that's a fundamental mistake, but yeah. So that started off a process that would mark me down for being hiked out of the dormitory for everybody else's transgressions. Even if I was asleep, they would call me out. So some people would say, she's asleep, matron, but she didn't believe them, so I was still hiked out for them talking. Not good. I was furnished with the requisite uniform bits that I didn't have from the second-hand store. I didn't mind that, except they didn't fit me. If you imagine an 11-year-old being given a blazer which is not only faded, terribly faded, I can see it to this day, terribly faded, but it was a size 38 chest. And it hung on me like a sack. It was so enormous. I just looked ridiculous. I also had to get all my summer clothes from the second-hand store. They were all incredibly faded. And when you are not from a wealthy family and you are sent to a small girls' boarding school, that is very expensive, but I think my father got the army to pay for it. In a very small boarding school with lots of wealthy girls there, well, practically all of them were wealthy, then little things like that really show up. They make you stick out like a sore thumb. And although most of the girls were really lovely, it, right from the get-go, I felt less than. I felt like the very poor relative that I was. And it really does make a difference. So when maybe your child gets the ability to go to a posh school, please make sure they have everything that they're going to need, everything name tag, everything you can figure out. Do your research, because I can tell you, being on the receiving end of that behaviour, of that treatment, is the worst start possible. It's a terrible position to put your child in. I'll tell you one thing. When we first arrived at this boarding school, I had with me a bag of cola cubes that I had to eat on the train. So when you get there, or when we got there, they said, right, give in your sweeties and we'll put them in a tin. And I'm thinking, oh no, I didn't know about that. And all the girls came with these big tins of sweeties they bought, or their parents had bought, loads and loads of easily retrievable sweeties. And I put my, probably, I think it was about 10 cola cubes in its little white bag, paper bag, into this tin they gave me. And when it came to prep time, which is homework time, you would have to line up in a queue, and the matron would unlock the sweetie cupboard, and then she'd say, right, you have to the count of 5. If you haven't got a sweet out by then, you go without. And most of the girls would get their tin, they would whip it open, they'd get their sweet, and done. So they probably, I think you're allowed two sweets. Not 2 bags of sweets, 2 sweets. And then they go into prep to do their homework. Here I am with this sticky, glued together lump of cola cubes because they got damp, the sugar had started to melt, they'd all coagulated, it was downright impossible to get them apart. First time I only got one, I managed to get apart. The rest of the time, it was a work in progress. Sometimes I'd manage to sort of almost get it apart, but the time ran out, so I went without. The other thing that my parents didn't find out about is that fruit was an extra. You had to pay extra if you wanted fruit. So, given that, I didn't have fruit all term. I didn't have anything. So I resorted to asking my fellow classmates, could I have your apple core? Because actually, some girls actually leave a lot of apple on an apple core, and I would eat the entire thing because, it was still an apple bit. Or if they had tangerines, then I would ask for the skin because it just had a bit of flavour. So they didn't find that out. And it was an extra, and they didn't pay for it. It must have been on the blurb about the school somewhere, but they just didn't. So that was another thing. So I actually eat an apple. I eat the entire thing to this day, apart from the stem, which is wood. I eat pips, core, the entire lot to this day, from the bottom all the way to the woody bit. Eventually, I was so homesick, I started writing letters to my mother to ask if I could leave. And in the first term you're there, they don't allow you home visits. They don't allow the parents to come and visit you, because they figure that you're going to be so homesick, you're going to beg your parents to take you away. And obviously my parents didn't want me. So nobody was allowed a home visit or a parental visit. And I would write them, please, please let me home. I promise I'll be good. I'll do this, I'll do that, to no avail. Because what I didn't realise is, although you have to leave the letters open so they can be read, I didn't realise they tear them up. They tear them up. And it was on the fourth such occasion that I had written this pleading letter to my mother that one of the teachers summoned me and said, you do realise we do read your letters, and this just isn't good enough. Please take this letter and rewrite it like something your parents would like to hear. So I did. It was, I didn't mention I wanted to leave. It was a rude awakening. Absolutely. That said, there were other times that were really great fun when somebody was taken out by their parents and they sneaked in a whole load of sweeties and then they shared them out underneath your pillow. Now that was lovely. And there were some girls who were really, really naughty, and they would get out of the dormitory, climb down a drain pipe, and then go into the kitchen garden, a walled kitchen garden, and steal berries and bring them back. I mean, they were very adventurous. But I swear, if I'd have done that, I would have been caught immediately. I just wasn't lucky like that. We used to go to church every Sunday, and when I laugh, my shoulders move. Now, I was best friends with a very, very funny girl. She used to make me laugh hysterically, and she would always sit next to me during Mass, and my shoulders would go like this. And as soon as we started walking out of the church, the matron would grab me by the collar and I would be sent to bed for the day. It was horrible, because only on a Saturday and Sunday did you get to go out in the school minibus to go and pick berries, to go on a walk somewhere or something like that. We were always in school uniform. We never had home clothes on. If we were taken to the shops, we weren't allowed to go into Woolworths because it was common. We just weren't allowed, says matron. And, when you are sent to bed for giggling, then you missed out on all that, and you missed out tea. So not a good time. Eventually, I did get away, which was great. And I really, really wanted to live with my father. But by that time, he had got divorced from my mother and remarried this German lady. I had not been invited or told about the weddings. He got married twice, once in a registry office, once as a white wedding. I wasn't invited. And that Christmas, when I spent the Christmas with them in Germany, everybody was looking at the video, or the film, cine film, I suppose, of the wedding and saying, oh, look at me, look at me, look at me. Look what I'm doing, so and so. And I was the only one that couldn't say, oh yes, I remember. And it got to the point I was so upset. I walked out of the room, I went to my own bedroom, and I cried and cried and cried. And do you know what? I still can feel the feelings of that girl, feeling so left out of the loop, of the father she adored. It was such a sad thing, but there you go. So we get to that point. They are divorced. My mother is living her own life. I think that's what she really wanted. And I was living with my father, who, it turns out, really did not want to have a child in this new marriage. He just didn't want me around. He didn't want anything to spoil his marriage or encumber it. You know, I couldn't disappear into the ether. You know, if you're not welcome in a home, there are several very petty things that can happen that, you know, if it were their own child together, that wouldn't be happening. For example, when my stepmother would go shopping, she would always buy a couple of multi-packs of Bounty bars. I know this is going to sound so petty. She would put them in the larder. There's little tiny Bounty bars. And once I thought, oh, they're in the car. I helped myself to one, actually. I got into so much trouble for doing that. I never did it again. I would ask if it's all right, may I have one? Sometimes it would be no. They were so unnecessarily mean. Actually, quite petty and mean. They would go out into the kitchen and they would both have a Bounty bar and quickly stuff it in their mouth and then come back into the room. I mean, who does that with a child? Just, when I think about it now as an adult, I accepted it then. But now as an adult, I think, goodness gracious, that was appalling behaviour. So we get to the point when at 14, I start to notice boys. I always went to an all-girls school, but you know, eventually you start going to a youth club and you start meeting the opposite sex. And I started to go out with boys. Now, my father didn't mind me going to the youth club, but he wanted me home before 9 p.m. And those boys were not allowed to walk me home to the door. So they would have to leave me at the top of the street, and then I would have to walk home. And it carried on in that vein forever, actually. And then I met somebody who was going to be my first husband when I was 15. I met him just before my 15th birthday. And I thought he must be okay because he smoked Benson and Hedges. Obviously, you know, that was my criteria. He smoked Benson and Hedges. Everybody else was smoking number 6. He obviously had style. I started going out with him. He drove a motorbike It was a 650 Triumph Bonneville T120R. Surprising the things you don't forget. It made a real rumble when he was coming down the road. I knew exactly when he was coming because I could hear it from 2 roads away. And I'd get on the back of his bike with my little red beret and my white coat, what a numpty, and that coat was splattered in road dirt up the back from his wheels. He always called me ugly. Hello, ugly. How are you doing? Hello, ugly. Hello, this, hello. But it was always ugly. And I did nothing about that. You know, if I'd have been the person that I am now, I wouldn't have given him a second look. But I had so little expectations of how people should treat me. Ugly seemed fine. We carried on going out. When I turned 15, I was so miserable staying at my father's house that I phoned my mother one night and I said, can I come and stay with you? And she lived in Romford, Essex. So my stepmother and my father were out that night, and when they got back the next morning, I said, I'm going to go and stay with my mum. And my father said, fine, I'll take you to the station. So I packed up my things. He got to the door of the station, bought me a ticket, and then he just left. He didn't wait for the train to come in, make sure I went on the right train, anything. I mean, bearing in mind we didn't have mobiles then or any form of communication or safety feature or anything, just walked away. So he left and I started living with my mother. And that's a whole other story. If you have been, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.